Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confess that I find myself somewhat surprised that a speaking slot has opened up at this hour. I found out a few moments ago. I've been enjoying this debate, and at this hour of night, I hope you'll forgive me that I try to cheer everybody up and tell you a short story about my daughter. We were watching Canada People's History. The last episode, I hate to tell you, did involve me. CBC decided, Mr. Speaker, that I was a good thread to describe the origins of the environmental movement. And my daughter had been watching this program in school. Thank goodness for the CBC and the great programming to tell Canadians about our history. And in this last episode, as it ended, she turned to me, she was in grade 4 at the time, and said, "Congratulations, Mummy, you're the first." And I said, "I'm the first what?" She said, "You're the first person who could ever watch themselves on Canada People's History because everybody else is dead." Well, I just thought the hour called for some levity. I find myself standing here, Mr. Speaker, having read Bill C-49 carefully, having listened to the debates, and particularly having heard what I regard as a very sincere, well-meaning presentation from the Minister of Heritage, for whom clearly this is a vision that he cares about deeply, and I think he has persuaded the Prime Minister to allow him to do something that I have come to believe is in the interests of Canada. Now, that's not without trepidation. It's not without sharing a lot of the skepticism of my colleagues on other opposition benches. But I come to this, Mr. Speaker. We have had this museum in one shape or another since 1856. It has not remained static, and it won't stay the Museum of History into another few generations. If we go back in 1856, it was for the displays of the Geological Survey of Canada. It was a hodgepodge, I can imagine, and by 1968 they decided to split it into two things. We still have it, of course, the Museum of Nature down on Metcalfe. That was one part of it. And the other part became known as, and all of my women colleagues in the House, brace yourself, they named it the Museum of Man. By 1986, it was seen that the Museum of Man was probably a gender-loaded term, and they didn't mean to call it that. One of my friends who's currently a parliamentarian here quipped that when they named this thing again, please God, let's not call it the Mausoleum of Men. Let's inject the history and the contribution of Canadian women. In any case, in 1986, the term Museum of Man changed to Museum of Civilization, and the inspired and entirely magnificent building on the other side of the river, built by architect Douglas Cardinal, was given to Canadians. I remember well, because I was living in Ottawa at the time, the Museum of Civilization was racing to the finish line, trying to be ready for opening. It was such a nip and tuck effort that they called on Canadian senators to show up and help Douglas Cardinal fit the bits of marble to the curvy bits. It's all curvy. My dear friend, now retired, Senator Mira Spivak, was one of those who showed up and was on her knees till after 11 o'clock at night, finishing work at the museum. Given current events, some people might suspect that was the last time senators actually worked. But in any case, it was a great opening. I love the Great Hall of the Peoples. I hate the idea that anything about it will change. I love the fact that the great silk screen of ancient forest that we see in the Museum of Civilization today is actually a photograph silk screened of Windy Bay in Guayahanas, and now part of Guayahanas National Park. I'd love it not to change at all, but change isn't a bad thing if we can use the additional money to make sure that exhibits that are now in storage get out to people across Canada. I see this as a way of invigorating our understanding of history. I have great concerns that the current administration is trying to remold our own iconography, how we see ourselves, get rid of our notion of peacekeeping and see ourselves as quote-unquote a warrior nation. I share these concerns, but I've gone to Section 26 of the Museum Act, and I see that the role of a curator and the role of the way a museum is run is separate from political interference, and we'll have to watchdog this as it goes forward. I'm not denying that, but I want the records of the debates of the Parliament in accepting a Museum of History to reflect that at least someone on the opposition benches was prepared to take a leap of faith, prepared to go with the Museum Minister of Heritage and say, yes, okay, let's modernize, let's update. We'll have a Museum of Canadian History. Hardly sounds like we're updating when we're going back to our history, but let's imagine for a moment we can. Let's imagine that we tell the stories of the women of Canada and their contribution, of the new Canadians that we celebrate at Pier 21 at Museum in Halifax. Let's exchange exhibits with Pier 21 in Halifax. Let's ensure that we tell the stories of the contributions of people whose stories are unsung and untold, and of the role that Canada has had in the world in the past, and that I hope we will reclaim by once again being the best country we can be, re-engaging with the world on climate negotiations, on drought negotiations, on all the things that we've done historically for worldwide development and so on. This legislation does include international exhibits. It doesn't say that we're going to be insular and parochial. So let's try to see if we can accept the idea of a Canadian Museum of History with an infusion of funds which allows our history to be real to our kids, and not just the kids who come to Ottawa to see the Museum of Civilization. By the way, I remember when the Museum of Civilization opened. As I said, I went to the opening. But beyond that, initially the exhibits were panned. People were outraged that we had Disneyfied, I think that's what some of the commentators said, that this museum had Disneyfied the collections, made them too touchy-feely, too hands-on, too kid-focused. Look, change will happen to the way we share our heritage. Change will happen to the way we tell our stories. I think if we engage ourselves with this effort in good faith, we will tell our stories more honestly. We will reflect more of the real Canadian mosaic and identity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.